All right, I think we're good to go. I've had somebody said they couldn't hear me very well, and I have a face for radio, but not the voice for it, I'm afraid. So I struggle with that sometimes, my voice. Maybe trying a different mic, maybe that'll help a little bit more tonight. You can understand what I'm saying. Welcome everybody back to our class tonight. Had somebody ask about my wife, and appreciate that. She is at home tonight, and has been having some better days. So hoping we're going to still making some progress in that account. But we have several in our congregation who are struggling with a lot of different health issues, and that's part of life, I reckon. We talked about this morning, being in our lesson about heaven, and that's one of the things we look forward to is none of these aches and pains. So that is something to look forward to. And we also have some who have lost loved ones recently from our number. But before we get started in our class tonight, ask Glenn if he'll lead us in opening prayer, if you don't mind. All right, we're on lesson 3 of our series on 12 ordinary men, and tonight we finally get into talking about one of those men. And unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of information about all of the 12. Some we have more than others, and tonight, this one we have a lot, and probably could make a couple of lessons out of it, and we may carry over and discuss some of it a little bit more at a later time, but we're going to try to get through the majority of the lesson. But tonight, lesson 3 is Peter, leader of the light. And if you did not get one of the handouts, I had some printed up back there, just a little outline with some fill-in-the-blank kind of stuff and kind of let you guide through as we talk about our lesson tonight. The key passages that we're looking at in this one, I do encourage you to read those. We won't read them all tonight, or we wouldn't have time to do much else. But Matthew 16 through 23, Mark 14, 37 through 38, Luke 22, 31 through 32, John 1, 43 through 55, 13, 4 through 7, and 21, 15 through 17, so a lot of it out of John. Also, Galatians chapter 2 and 1 Peter 1, verses 3 through 7. So those are some things that relate to our lesson tonight as we're talking about it. Last week, we discussed about the list. We used the analogy kind of the dream team, basketball team back in 92 that won the basketball Olympics, men's Olympics team, and how those 12 men were extraordinary. These 12 are ordinary, and tonight we'll get into those 12, as we said, one in particular. But we talked about the list a little bit. But just to review a little, we have 4 lists of the 12 apostles in the New Testament, and we read where those were. And all 4 biblical lists, the same men are named, and the order in which they're given is pretty similar. Not exactly, but very similar. The first name in all 4 of those lists is always Peter. So Peter stands out. He is the leader. He's the spokesman for that whole group of 12. And if you hadn't studied this, you may not really have thought about the 12 having a leader other than Jesus. And, of course, when he was on earth, he was the leader. But then later, when he ascended back into heaven, Peter assumed that role. And we're going to look at some things about Peter tonight and some things that made him a good leader and some things that hindered him from being a leader. And hopefully we'll learn some things that we can apply to ourselves as leaders. Because I can imagine that the number that people in this group, this size, and all of us have been in leadership role in one time or another, whether that's at work, whether it's in your family, whatever situation that may be in activity here at church or whatever. But, thinking about how that relates and how you go about being a leader and how Jesus went about forming his leader. Because one of the big things we'll look at tonight. But those 12 are arranged, like we said, in 3 groups of 4. The same 3 names are listed first in each group. Group 1 is Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Group 2, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, and Thomas. Group 3, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas Iscariot. So those groups appear to be pretty much listed in descending order based on their intimacy with Jesus. So how close they were to him. You know, he started out, we said last week, preaching to thousands. And then after he kind of got a little tougher with his message, several of those kind of melted away. And they said, this is too hard. And then he asked his 12, are y'all going to leave me too? And they said, where else can we go? You have the words of life. So they stuck with him. And several more, but particularly these. And then he went and he chose the 12 after spending the night in prayer. But even in a group of 12, it's hard to be really, really close to all of them. You know, even with your kids, if you've got multiple children, I've got 3, then you have a different relationship with all of them. It doesn't mean you love one any less than you do the other one. You know, when you have that first one, you may think, well, I could never love another one as much as I do this one. But then you have that second child, if you have that second one, and you don't divide the love, you multiply it. So now you have twice the love you had before. You love them both. And we thought we were going to have 2, and then I'm surprised we had a third one. And she's the baby, and she's a handful. And I have all girls, but one of the ladies I used to teach with, she said, she's your boy. That baby one is. She's your little one that's kind of like the boy of the family. And you know, people lied to us when we were expecting Maddie, our youngest. They said there's no difference really in having 3 and 2. They lied. There was a big difference. Maybe it was just her, but there was a big difference. And so, but Jesus did have 12 that he was in his group. But of those first 4, that first group, he was a little closer with. And maybe it's just because they were the first ones called, the first ones he chose, and they spent a little bit more time with him. But even out of that first 4, there was 3 that was kind of his inner circle, and he spent more time with them. Matter of fact, you know, they were with him on some of the major events in his ministry when the others were either not there or not as close, like the Mount of Transfiguration, the heart in the Garden of Gethsemane. They were there, Peter, James, and John. So there was a kind of a hierarchy to this group. All the 12, what we said last week, had different personalities. Tonight we'll talk about Peter in particular, but Peter basically, you can describe him, he was eager, he was aggressive, he was bold, he was very outspoken. The author had a good little thing. He says he had a habit of revving his mouth while his brain was in neutral. And you may know some people like that. You know, they're in that thing, and when they start to do something, it's ready, fire, aim. You know, they aim last. They go ahead and shoot before they're really zeroed in on what they should be doing. They have big plans. They're always into it, and sometimes they don't able to carry out because they overestimate what maybe they're capable of doing. The author also refers to him as the apostle with the foot-shaped mouth. I think that's pretty good. You know, he was prone to stick his foot in his mouth from time to time. And hearing those things right off the bat, if you never studied anything about the Bible, you may think, well, how did this guy get to be the leader? And it doesn't sound like he's got the stuff that would want to be leader of your group, especially a group this important, but we'll see some things that he does. But going back just a minute to leadership, what is a leader? Leadership is not a title, okay? You know, some people do step into leadership roles sometimes. Maybe they're not ready at the time. And sometimes that can go to your head a little bit, and you think you're a leader when you're not. You know, I've heard that before. If you're leading and nobody's following, you're just taking a walk. Okay, there's nobody back there behind you. It'd be like the parade. Here comes the guy in front leading the band, but looks behind, there's no band. Okay, so a leadership is the ability to inspire followership. So you have to be able to inspire, to motivate people to do things, to pull them all together and get a job done. And, of course, Jesus was great at that. He organized the 12 from, like we've said over and over, ordinary men who really, from worldly view, had no business in this position. But he was able to turn them into what he needed them to be. And they all became leaders of the church. You know, a leader, another thing I've heard about leadership before is a leader grows other leaders. If you're going to, if you're in a leadership role, you're not always going to be there. And part of your job should be to groom somebody else and get them ready to take your place. When I was principal at Winfield, the middle school, for several years, I hired a lady to be my math teacher in 6th grade. And she had great leadership ability. And I told her, I said, I'm hiring you to be the math teacher in 6th grade because I need your personality in that group down there to make them gel and work. But I'm also thinking in a few years you're going to be principal. And she is. She took over. She ended up not being at the middle school, she was at the elementary, but she ascended to that role quickly. But I knew when I interviewed her, we need to hire this lady because she's got the right stuff, as they say. When we're talking about the space program, she had the right stuff. So, we look for somebody else we can train. And Jesus did that. He spent those 3 years preparing the 12 to be leaders and establishing the church, and of those particularly, Peter to be leader of the 12. So that's kind of where we're going with it tonight. All right. Part 2, Simon, also called Peter. What's in a name? Does a name mean anything? A lot of times, people in Hollywood or whatever, they change their name. They're not who their name just doesn't have that appeal. If you think of John Wayne, rough, Western, John Wayne was not his name. I think his name was Marion Morris or something like that. That doesn't really sound like rough and tumble John Wayne. It just doesn't sound right. So sometimes a name is chosen for a reason. We're going to look at that tonight. So the first person in the first group, the man who became the spokesman and overall leader of the group, was Simon, whom he also named Peter. We read that in Luke chapter 6, verse 14. Simon was a very common name in biblical times. There are at least 7 Simons in the gospel accounts alone. So if we read just the first 4 books of the Bible, we mention 4 different Simons. Even among the 12, there were 2 Simons, Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot. We mentioned him last week. But Simon's full name, if you want to call it a full name, they didn't have first and last names and middle names like we do today, but the men were pretty much named in connection with who their father was. So Simon's full name at birth was Simon Bar-Jonah, Bar meaning son. So Simon, the son of Jonah. And see that in Matthew chapter 16, verse 17. Simon's father's name then was Jonas, or sometimes Jonah, Jonas, or John. All those kind of interchangeable there. And really we don't know anything more about his parents than that. So we don't know a whole lot about John's background other than who his father was. Now, also, as we read a little further, we notice here what it said above, that Jesus gave him another name. So Luke, in his account, introduces Peter this way: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and he being Jesus. So Jesus didn't merely give him a name to replace the old one; he also named him Peter. All right, that's important. So it was Simon and Peter, both those names. He was sometimes known as Simon, sometimes known as Peter, and sometimes as Simon Peter, depending on where we read in the Scripture and what it's talking about. If it's just talking about him as just a regular old guy, a lot of times they'll call him Simon or Simon Peter. And then when he gets into how he deals with Jesus or Jesus deals with him, there's a big distinction in the 2 names and which one he's called by. Peter was sort of a nickname, and it means rock. Petros, where Peter comes from, is Greek for stone. So his name became Rocky. In the Aramaic for that is Cephas. So sometimes we'll see that word Cephas. Cephas is also another a name in a different pronunciation of that, or a different language as we look at his name. There's a lot of nicknames. We like nicknames for some reason. Sports particularly have a lot of nicknames. Tiger Woods. Tiger's not Tiger's real name. His name is Eldrick. That's kind of a mouthful too for somebody who's a big golfer. But the story is told that his dad named him or called him Tiger because he said he wanted him to realize he was going to have to be fierce and work for it if he wanted to accomplish what he wanted to do in the world of golf. So he started calling him Tiger. And a lot of us may have had a nickname. I've heard a nickname or two for some in this room. I'll tell you, my my granddaddy's nickname for me, if he promised never to say it again. But when I was a little bitty fella, maybe 1 or 2, just learning to walk, get around, my granddad called me Shorty. And he still called me. He called me that till I was 12 or 13 years old, I guess, till I finally got a little taller. But I never did get real tall, so maybe it stuck. I told him there's 2 reasons I never got tall. One, my granddaddy branded me as Shorty, and my daddy always told me when I got in trouble to go get me a switch as tall as you are, and I didn't want to get a bigger switch. So both reasons I didn't get very tall. But this nickname here, it meant something. In John 1:42, he describes Jesus' first face-to-face meeting with him. It says, "Now when he looked at him, he said, 'You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You will be called Cephas,' which is translated to stone." So those were apparently the very first words that Jesus ever said to Peter. From then on, Rock was his nickname. Like we said, there's all kind of nicknames. And he had, and we'll get into some of the names that Jesus had for the rest of the 12. Others had nicknames too. We was talking about sports. We got Paul Bear Bryant, Pistol Pete Maverick, Michael Air Jordan, William the Refrigerator Perry, name Mean Joe Green, a lot of names that we're familiar with in the sports world. And a lot of times that name has something to do with the way you look. Sometimes it's how they want you to act, and maybe sometimes it's something about your personality. I played ball with a boy who was a couple years older than me, but he was a redhead, and a true redhead, and his name was Jimmy Johnson, and we called him Redbone. And Redbone was he was a lot like Peter. When I start thinking about Peter, I always think about Redbone, because he had that shoot first, aim later kind of personality. When we at our school, when growing up, our elementary school was on one side of town, high school on the other, and we did not have a cafeteria at the high school, so we had to take a bus. We bus students over to the elementary to the cafeteria at lunchtime. And everybody didn't go to lunch, but several of us would. And we had a teacher, one of our coaches, he would drive us over. One day, the guy coach was supposed to drive the bus got held up in the office, and Jimmy's a senior in high school, and he gets tired of sitting there, and he said, "We're going to lunch." So he got on the driver's seat and drove a busload of students across town. They didn't go over very good. He got in a lot of trouble, but that's Jimmy how he was. And he ended up being a drill sergeant in the Marines, and he was a true Marine. And I slept better at night knowing he was guarding the border, because he was going to be full speed ahead. Whatever it took, he was going to get the job done. But we see those kind of names. I'll tell you one more nickname, and I'll let it go. But we had a boy when I was coaching at Britt when I first started, moved in, and he was a big boy. And he'd been so big that they wouldn't let him play football at his old school. They were afraid he'd have a heart attack. So we let him come out. We just said, "We're going to have to get you in shape." But his name was Keith. And one day the librarian was talking to me about him, and she kept calling him Bob. I said, "Who are you talking about?" And she said, "Bob." And he walked down the hall. I said, "His name's not Bob, it's Keith." She said, "No, Bob, big old boy. That's Bob." So that became his nickname, was Bob. He was a big old boy. So those names have a meaning. The name was significant here because the Lord had a specific reason for choosing it. By nature, we said already, Peter could be brash. He could be undependable. He tended to make a lot of promises he couldn't keep. He's one of those persons who kind of leaps in wholeheartedly into something, but then a lot of times bails out before he finishes it. So we know some people like that maybe. He was usually the first one in, and too often he was the first one out. So Jesus wanted a name for him that's going to be a consistent reminder to him about who he should be. So from that point on, whenever Jesus called him one of those names, it sent him a subtle message. If he called him Simon, he was letting him know that he was acting like his old self and not the rock that he needed him to be. And I skipped this part, but the name Simon actually means reed. So it's like a soft grass that's easily bent. And that kind of described him. He was not steady. He was not that, strong oak. He was more that willow that kind of bent every time the wind turned. He wanted to stand up there, but he just couldn't make himself sometimes. So he used that to remind him, just by calling his name, what needed to happen. Another sports story ties in with this, and our author tells this one in her book. But it says, if you remember, Tommy Lasorda was the manager of the L.A. Dodgers for several years. And he tells a story about having a young, skinny little pitcher who was new to their minor league system. And he saw him in pitch, and he thought, well, he's got a lot of potential. He had a strong arm and good control, but he didn't have that real attacking kind of mode, that aggressiveness to him. Tommy Lasorda met him. He started calling him Bulldog. And that was the exact opposite of how he was. Here's this tall, skinny kind of boy that's not real aggressive, and he started calling him Bulldog. And eventually, he held him that long enough till he sunk in, and he started playing like a Bulldog. And his name, if you know anything about his baseball, was Orel Hershiser. And Hershiser turned out to be a great pitcher, played for about 18 years in the major leagues. He was MVP, he was Cy Young Award winner, all these things, awards that he won as a baseball player. But he didn't start out that way. He had potential, but he had to be molded, he had to be shaped, he needed some coaching. And that's what Lasorda did to him. Story here that's going to relate to something we tell about Peter in a few minutes, but his teammates tell a story about, they think, when he really kind of made that change. They pinpoint it back to one game. He was on the mound, and he was struggling and kind of wimping out a little bit, and said, Lasorda called timeout and walks out to the mound. And he said, "You talking about a chewing." He said he chewed him upside one side and down the other on the mound in front of the whole crowd, both teams, everything. And it was so bad that they started calling it the Sermon on the Mound instead of the Sermon on the Mount. But after that, he changed, and he got a little tougher. You know, and as a coach, you have to know what buttons to push on certain players to get them to perform. Some, they need a pat on the back. If you get onto them, they'll melt. Some can take a good chewing, and it helps them, it motivates them. So Hershiser was like that. He needed that, and once he had it, then he turned out well. We're going to see something similar happen with Simon here a little bit later. But this young man, Simon, who would become Peter, he was impetuous, he was impulsive, he was overeager, and he needed to become more like the rock. So that's what Jesus called him, and it had an influence on him. So we also see Jesus calling him Simon in reference to the key failures in his career. Let's look at Luke 22 and 31. There is where Jesus is talking about that he is going to, there he's talking about to Peter about his betrayal. And, Jesus is telling him what's going to happen, and, Peter says, "No, that's not going to happen, Lord. Not going to happen." He says, "I'll die with you. I'll go to prison with you, but I'll never forsake you. I'll never turn my back on you." But we all know that he did. But Jesus got on to him, and he said, "Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you like wheat." He said, "But I'm going to pray for you so that you can be strong." But he says, "I'm going to give you right here, and Satan's really going to give you a test right here. But I'm going to pray for you, and you're going to come through it." But there he called him Simon twice. Then later in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter should have been watching and praying, he was one of those three who went with Jesus to the center of the garden. Jesus came back, and he was asleep. And it says, Mark writes, Jesus came and found him sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Mark 14, 37 and 38. So we can probably relate to that. There's times when we really want to do something that's kind of hard to do. I went to the doctor recently, and one day last week, and did my yearly checkup. And he said, "Man, all your numbers are great, except for one, the one in the middle." He says, "Before you come back next year, I want you down 2 pant sizes." He said, "I really don't care what you weigh, but you got to do something about this gut." So he's trying to motivate me, okay? But, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, okay? And when I walk through the kitchen and there's something there to eat, it's calling my name, and I had a hard time walking on past sometimes, I can go with, and maybe I'll do well most of the day. If I'm at work and I get home for supper, I'm like, I'm eating everything that I can find, I can make up for lost time. So, that I can relate to Peter here that's going to sleep, couldn't keep his eyes open. We can all be like that from time to time. So when Peter needed admonishment, Jesus called him. He called him Simon. And Peter would cringe. We don't know this, but just from human being, probably thinking about when he heard him say this, when he heard Jesus say Simon, he was probably thinking, "Lord, please call me Rock." And the Lord probably would reply to him, "I'll call you Rock when you act like a rock." Okay. You growing up in the South, my grandmother Key you may have a grandmother like mine, but my grandmother was sweet, loving. She petted me. She cooked me anything I wanted to eat. I blame her for some of my weight issues, I guess. But anything I wanted, she was a great cook. But when you was in trouble, you was in trouble. And she would get a switch too. She didn't see mom and dad. She would take care of it. But when she called me by my whole name, first, middle, and last, it was on. I knew I had done something really bad. I was running through the house one time in the summer with my cousins, and she had a nice storm door, glass in it, aluminum door. And I didn't know that the plunger was taken loose. I didn't know that. So I come running through and slammed it. And when I did, it shattered. The glass went everywhere. I heard my whole name. Okay, so that was one time I knew I was in trouble. Okay, so kind of how it was with Jesus. When he needed to get on to Peter, he called him that Simon. He knew he had it. Then after the resurrection, Jesus instructed his disciples to return to Galilee because that's where he was going to meet up with them. We read that in Matthew 28:7. Impatient Simon here, kind of like my buddy Redbone, apparently got tired of waiting. So he announced to the rest of them, I'm going fishing. Okay, so being the leader, they went with him. So when he announced he was going fishing, the others went fishing too. So after they followed him, they got in the boat, fished all night, caught nothing. Remember the next morning that Jesus met them on the shore. And there he was cooking breakfast, cooking fish. They hadn't caught anything. Jesus had fish sitting there, and he was cooking some for them. Now the main purpose of that breakfast meeting here seemed to be for the restoration of Peter. So what was the meeting about? It was to give Peter a second chance and get him back on board. Because he had just messed up big time. What had he just done? He had just denied Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed, just like he told him he would do. And he was very ashamed. Do you remember that story? He follows him to the high priest's house, and people was asking him, hey, weren't you with him? No, it wasn't me. And eventually the third time, he even curses and said it wasn't me. And then the rooster crows, and about that time he turns, and Jesus turns to look at him and locks eyes with him. And, he must have felt like he was about that tall then. Here I have let him down. The guy that I swore I'd be with him no matter what, I've lied and said I don't even know him. So on this occasion, Jesus had to get him back in the game. He had made a mistake, but he had to get him back up. Another one of those coaching things. Sometimes when a player makes a mistake, you don't need to chew them out for it. They know they messed up. Peter knew he messed up. You need to pull them in, pat them on the back, tell them you still believe in them, and go back in there and do better. And that's kind of what happened here. 3 times here Jesus addressed him as Simon and asked him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? And we read there in John chapter 21, verses 15 through 17. And 3 times, we won't go through and read that word for word, but 3 times here, Peter affirmed that he did. And the last time he was even getting a little bit aggravated. He said, I love you. You know all things. I love you. He said, well, tend my sheep or feed my sheep. So that was the last time that Jesus ever had to call him Simon. From that day forward, that got him back on track, and he was ready to go. Certain positions, football, your quarterback, he needs to be confident. He doesn't need to be looking over his shoulder, afraid if he makes a mistake, he's going to get jerked out of the game. The coach needs to let him know he's got confidence in him. So that's kind of how it was here. Jesus is calling his quarterback over. He's calling Peter over, and he says, hey, I know you messed up. You denied me 3 times. I'm going to ask you 3 times, do you love me? So for every time you deny me, I'm going to ask you that question. And I'm going to make the point across to you, okay, then here's the job I got for you. Feed my sheep. Take care of the flock. You're going to be the one who establishes the church here in a few days. I need you to get that out of your head, and let's get back in the game and let's get on it. So that's what happened. And from then on, Peter became the rock. He stood up and preached that day on the day of Pentecost, like we read about, and did a great job, of course. But, we kind of be harsh on Peter sometimes, but he was really just like most Christians. He's like us. He had a carnal side. He had a spiritual side. Had times he did good, times he did bad. Sometimes he succumbed to the habits of the flesh. Sometimes he functioned in a spirit, really high level. He was sinful sometimes. At other times he acted like a righteous man, all that. So he was wishy-washy, if you don't call it that. But sometimes Peter, or sometimes Simon, sometimes Peter, but he eventually became the leader of the 12. So that name was God's way of motivating him and sticking with him. All right, part 3. Follow me, I will make you fishers of men. So let's go back and tell a little bit about Simon as a person. We know what he was. He was a fisherman. That was his trade. Him and his brother Andrew were heirs to the family fishing business. Sometimes I think we kind of get off base. I have, speaking for myself, here thinking about that, they just had just one little rinky-dink flat-bottom boat, and, it was just them out there trying to scrounge out, making a living. But I think more I studied this, it was a pretty big operation. It says they had boats. There was more than one. They must have had other people maybe that worked for them. So they had inherited this from their dad. We do know that they inherited that fishing business from their dad. They started out in Bethesda, and they moved on up to Capernaum. And they caught fish, of course, on the Sea of Galilee. It's on the northern end of Galilee. Peter had a house there. We see that. And he also had a wife. We don't hear much about Peter's wife, but he was married. We don't know anything about children, whether he had any children or whether they were already grown when this happened, when this all started. I kind of lean toward maybe he didn't have any kids, because we don't hear that. Because we hear about Jesus healing his mother-in-law. So he had a mother-in-law, he had a wife. Okay, so, and we read some more about her a little bit later. Matter of fact, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:5 that Peter took his wife on this mission. So one of his apostolic missions, he took his wife with him. So we do know where he lived. Archaeologists think, and we're finding all kind of stuff in the last few years as we get better technology look, but we found a lot of stuff that the naysayers have been saying, atheists for years, well, there is no God. Those places in the Bible never existed. We're finding those places. As we dig and find in the rocks, we're finding more of those. I read yesterday where they think they found the Pool of Siloam, where Jesus healed the blind man. They think they found that now. They didn't think it existed. So the town he was from hadn't found the ruins of it, particularly just a little bit of stuff. But some think that there was a church built on top of what was Peter's house at one time. So we don't know that, but that's just some interesting side things to think about there. But like I said, we do know what he did for a living. We do know he was a businessman and fairly successful, evidently. Had multiple boats. He was married, had a family, and what he did for a living. So we also know that Peter was a leader of the apostles. Not only from the fact that his name is always first. We mentioned that a while ago. Every time you see the list, his name's always at the top. But that's not really where we get that idea from. There is an explicit statement in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 2. It reads like this. It says, "Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter." Okay, first. Okay, that must mean he's first on the list. No, because when you look at the translation, that word first there, that Greek word protos, it doesn't refer to the first on the list. That word means chief or leader. So in this verse, when you look at how it is translated from the original language, it tells us here that he was the leader of the 12. He was the chief. And also, Peter's leadership is also evident from the fact that anytime that there had to be a spokesman, it's him. He's the one who does the speaking for the group. He's always in the foreground, taking the lead. He just seems to kind of have that naturally dominant personality. Some people kind of have that. And the Lord put it to good use among the 12. He chose the 12. Like we said, we've harped on the fact that they were ordinary, but they had things in them that only Jesus and God could see. They had traits in there, I believe, that he knew he could do something with. They just hadn't been developed yet. He was scouting for talent. He knew talent when he saw it. It was Jesus himself who shaped and trained Peter to be the leader here. So we look at Peter, we can see kind of how God goes about building a leader. All right, Peter's name is, a few facts right here that kind of blew my mind when I read this, and this is straight out of the book. It says Peter's name is mentioned in the gospel more than any other name except Jesus. So in the first 4 books of the Bible, Peter's name is mentioned more than anybody except Jesus. After chapter 12, Paul takes over and hear about him a lot. But no one speaks as often as Peter does. No one is spoken to by the Lord as often as Peter is. No apostle is rebuked by the Lord as much as Peter. And no apostle ever rebukes the Lord except Peter in Matthew 16:22. So some things about Peter kind of showed his importance was how many times he was mentioned. He's the one who's asking questions, the one who's answering, the one who Jesus praises, and also the one who he gets on to the most. No one ever confessed Christ more boldly or acknowledged his lordship more explicitly than Peter did. No other apostle ever verbally denied Christ as forcefully or as publicly as Peter did. We just mentioned that. The night of his trial, when he was arrested, Peter, very outspoken, and he didn't know who he was. Yet Peter also, no one was praised and blessed by Christ as much as Peter was, but he's also the only one that Christ ever addressed as Satan. So he went from one extreme to another, and actually all that in one instance. He went from praising him and telling him he's going to give him the keys of the kingdom, and then a few minutes later, he's calling him Satan. All right, so the Lord had harsher things to say to Peter than he ever did to any of his others. Again, going back to that coaching thing, sometimes you know who you can get on to, who needs that little kick to get them started. I went to a retirement party this afternoon. A friend of mine that I coached with for a long time, he retired this year and had a little get-together for him. And he was our offensive line coach at that time. And we had a boy, he was a big old boy and a great player. Ended up signing D1 and playing college football and being their top lineman. And the coach had to stay on him all the time. And he said, he would say at practice sometimes, he said, I hate to talk to him the way I do. He said, but I have to, because that's the only way I can get him to do anything. He said, after me chewing him out, he said, he'll call me up and say, hey, Coach, you want to go fishing? He said, he don't mind it. He realizes that. He'll say, hey, you don't have to get on me. I need a good kick every now and then. So he didn't physically kick him, but chewing him out until he must go. So kind of how Peter was here. He could take a chewing when he had to. So all that contributed to making him the leader Christ wanted him to be. God took a common man here that was impulsive, had an unsubmissive personality, and shaped him into this rock-like leader. The greatest preacher among the apostles in every sense, the dominant figure in the first 12 chapters of Acts, like we said a few minutes ago. We see in Peter's life the three key elements that go into making a true leader. This is what we're going to focus on for the rest of our lesson here. Three things that make a good leader. The right raw material, the right life experiences, and the right character qualities. So what are some raw materials that makes a good leader? Well, we've all probably heard the age-old debate whether leaders are born or made. We may all have an opinion on that, okay? You look at a leader, in whatever position he may be in, we'll say, well, that guy's a born leader. Or sometimes somebody had to kind of mold him into that. Well, personal opinion of mine is there's a little bit of both. You need some things inside of you, but that has to be molded or it can get way out of hand in either direction. I think Peter's a strong argument for that belief that people are born with those certain innate or God-given abilities, but they have to be shaped and make them into a leader. So Peter had that God-given fabric of leadership woven in his personality. He was made of the right raw material with certain rather obvious features that were critical to his leader ability. These are not generally characteristics that can be developed merely by training, but have to have innate features of his temperament. So what are those? The first one is inquisitiveness, okay? Somebody that wants to know, okay? Curiosity. You may have had, when your kids were small, you got tired of them asking you questions. They ask you something every 5 minutes. What is this? What is this? What is this? Why is the sky blue? Where's babies come from? Whatever. They had tons of questions. All right? So when you're looking for a leader, you want somebody who's going to ask questions. People are content with what they don't know. Ones that are happy to be ignorant and don't understand. Complacent, that they haven't analyzed. Comfortable with problems they haven't solved. In general, these people can't lead. Knowledge is power. You've heard that before. Now, we live in the information age, and we hear that all the time. Knowledge is power. Whoever has the information has the lead. That's true in the stock market. You got to know. You got to study it. You got to study a lot of these things. I worked for my great uncle there for a while. He was a business leader and businessman and been real successful. And I went with him on a trip one time when he was buying some equipment. He said, I study this stuff. He said, I know what I can buy it for, what it's going to cost me to fix it, and what I can sell it for. And he said, I keep score. He said, you coach, you keep score on the scoreboard. I keep score how much money I make. And he had made enough money that time. He really didn't need the money, per se. But he said, I keep score by how much money I make. So he researched it. He studied it. So you had to have that knowledge. The best problem solvers are driven by unquenchable enthusiasm for knowing and understanding things. So in the gospel accounts, Peter asked more questions than all the other apostles combined. He's always asking something. Usually Peter who asked the Lord to explain the difficult sayings in Matthew 15:15, Luke 12:41. It was Peter who asked him how often he needed to forgive. It was Peter who asked what reward the apostles would get for leaving everything to follow Jesus. It was Peter who asked him about the withered fig tree. It was Peter who asked questions of the risen Christ. He always wanted to know more, to understand more. So, again, we see a lot of mention of Peter in the New Testament, especially the first 4 books. But over and over, he's asking questions. He's that kid in the front of the classroom, always hand up. Why? Explain it to me. Okay. The second necessary ingredient we have to have here is initiative. You want somebody who's a self-starter. You want that, and it seems to be every generation that seems to get less and less kind of ingrained in us for some reason. I hate to say that, but I've saw that myself. But my friend I was telling you about earlier went to his party day. While I was in my boot, I couldn't mow my grass, so he's got 2 teenage sons, and they came down and mowed it for me 2 or 3 times. And first time they mowed, they divided up. One of them did the mowing, the other one did the trimming, and I've got a battery-powered trimmer. And I thought I had it charged, and I thought I had another battery ready, but it ran out pretty quick. And the youngest of the 2 boys, Jake, he said, "Hey," he said, it's dead. What do you want me to do? I said, "Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal." I said, "Weed eating's not a big deal. I need to get y'all to mow the grass for me." Well, I came around the corner of the house in about 30 minutes. He's at the corner of the house, and he's pulling up grass by hand. I didn't tell him to do that. His daddy trained him that way. He's a worker. And he wasn't going to stand around and wait for somebody to tell him what to do. He was going to find a way to get the job done. And that's why I bragged on him to his dad. I said, what I expected out of him, but I was really proud of him. I knew you'd be proud of him for what a good worker he is. But, Peter was like that. He was a self-starter. He not only asked questions, he was usually the first one to answer any questions that Christ posed. Sometimes he had to take a step back. He had to undo. He had to retract. He'd get rebuked for the fact he was always willing, though, to grab that opportunity by the throat. And that's what marked him as a leader. A couple examples of that. One, when Christ asked his apostles, he said, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" They answered, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Then Jesus asked, "But who do you say that I am?" It was Peter. The rest of them was kind of sitting around thinking about what they should say, what answer they could give. Didn't want to sound stupid. But Peter jumped right up and he said, "You're the Christ, Son of the living God." So the others were afraid to come forward, not Peter. He was bold. He was going to jump out there and say what he had on his mind. He was right. He wasn't always right, but this time he was. But that was an example of him being bold and decisive. Another one was when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. We talk about, it says that they came to get Jesus. It wasn't 2 or 3 of them. There was a whole crowd of them. And some historians think that there may have been up to 500 or 600 Roman soldiers that night, because that whole garrison, that was the normal number of soldiers that was stationed there, and they think they probably brought all of them. So probably in and around, he was outnumbered 500 to 1. And what does Peter do? He whips out his sword and takes a whack at one of them and cuts his ear off. Malchus, high priest's servant, I don't think he was aiming for his ear. I think he was trying to cut his head off. Okay, and that would probably, if he had succeeded, that wouldn't have went over very well. What did Christ do though? He rebuked him in front of everybody. He takes the guy's ear and puts it back on and reattaches it to his head. Which I've always wondered, if I'm there and I see that, do I really want to arrest this guy? If he's that powerful, I just saw him put somebody's ear back on and get cut off. Maybe we should just leave him alone. But anyway, they did. But Peter was not thinking about the odds. He was thinking about, I got to do something here. I'm going to make something happen. And a lot of times that's how leaders does. There is a saying, you may have heard it before. It says it's a lot easier to tone down a fanatic than it is to resurrect a corpse. So if you got somebody doing something, it's easier to take somebody you're having to say whoa than it is say giddy up. Okay. So usually if you got somebody you want to do a job, you'd rather have that person who's got that initiative, who's willing to get on and jump in there and do something, instead of one stand back with their hands in their pocket. Peter needed to be trained. He had to be shaped. He had to mature. But to do the job here that Christ had for him, he needed that moxie. He needed that courage. Think about what he did first. He stood up on Pentecost, preached to a crowd, thousands of people, who had just executed their Messiah. And he's up here telling them, you folks are wrong. You messed up. He's not backing down here. So, again, we said a while ago, after Jesus got onto him that last time and kind of got him back on the straight and narrow path, he never had to call him Simon again. He was Peter from then on. And that's a great example there. Third element of raw material that makes a leader is involvement. True leaders are not in the back. They're not in the middle. They're on the front. They're up in the middle of the action. We read about several military leaders through history that would recognize as great leaders. Alexander the Great was one of the more famous ones probably. Conquered most of the known world at that time, and he was famous for always being on his horse with his sword right in the front of the fight leading his troops. And they would follow him because of that, because they knew He would not ask them to do anything that he wouldn't do. He was right there. Go back to World War II, George Patton. Okay, Patton got in trouble for doing things sometimes, but he was also, his men respected him, and they would lead him and fight for him. I ran into again, somebody told me recently, it was Veterans Day, but introduced me to this fellow, and he was their granddaddy, I think, but he was in Patton's army in World War II, and he was proud of it, that he fought under Patton. He said, we loved him. We'd do anything he asked us to do. We'd run through a wall for him because we knew he was right there with us. He wasn't sitting way back somewhere with a set of binoculars, seeing what was going on in the fight. He was leading the fight. And then in the Old Testament, King David, that's how he was. When he got popular, it said Saul has killed his thousands, David has killed his 10,000s. So David was always out front leading the fight. So that true leader does that. They don't sit back in the background, tell everybody else what to do while they're kind of in comfort back here. True leader goes out with a cloud of dust. He's always showing the way. A couple examples of Peter here. The first one we think about is when he walked on the water. Jesus came one night to the Sea of Galilee, and stormy, and they're all in the boat, and they look, and they see this figure coming at them across the water, and they think it's a ghost. They all get scared. What does Peter do? He doesn't get scared. Okay, he jumps up. He says, Lord, is it you? If it is, command me to come to you on the water. So that's in Matthew 14, 27, 29. And before anybody knew what happened, Jesus said, come. He jumped out. And we think about, when we kind of focus on the fact that he was sinking, and he asked Jesus to save him, but you also have to remember, he took several steps on the water before he finally sank. Okay? So he had faith. He was ready to take the initiative. He was leading out front. While the rest of the apostles were sitting in the boat, he was out of the boat going where Jesus was. He said, tell me to come to you. I'm coming. So give him credit there for being the first one to leave the boat to begin with. In example 2 we mentioned a while ago, Peter denied Christ. And we kind of look at that always as a negative. And he did. That was not a good thing. But also keep in mind that only him and John were the only apostles who followed Jesus that night. The rest of them scattered and left. He followed him all the way to the house because he wanted to be close to him and see what was going on. Even though he couldn't do anything, and he didn't know what to do, I'm sure, he was disappointed. He couldn't stand to completely leave him, so he was there so he could see what was going to happen to him. And if he hadn't have been there where Jesus could look him in the eye, that would have never happened. So he had to be close to the action to see what was going on. He had that involvement. When everybody else bailed out, he stood there. He stayed there. So the raw fabric of which Peter was made had insatiable inquisitiveness, a willingness to take the initiative, and a passion to be personally involved. Now it was up to the Lord to train him and shape him. Because if you think about it, that's a good thing, but it also can be dangerous. If you have a person like that who's untrained, they can get you in trouble sometimes. All right, life experiences. Life experiences shape a true leader. I worked at a company really 2 summers when I was in college, at a furniture plant. And first summer there, I guess. But the owner of the company, his son, was a little bit older than I was. He had graduated college with a degree in business management, and he was going to take over the company eventually. But his dad did not hand him the keys to the station wagon or whatever right now and say, here, son, it's yours. He made him work in the plant, out in the manufacturing plant, and do every job in the plant for a pretty good length of time. He had to work on the line all through the assembly process, then shipping, receiving. He did it all. And after he had done that for several months, I think maybe in a year or 2, then Dad said, okay, now you know how this thing works. Now you can run it. But he didn't give it to him at first. So he's going to make sure he had the life experiences in that business so he would be able to run that. And his people would respect him knowing he would do that. You see that sometimes in business where the leader will take off his tie and jump out there. And if they're short-handed that day, he'll get in there and do the work himself. I went to get some tires the other day, and I was calling about a guy to get some wheels from a truck. And he said, well, we had a guy go home sick. Said he's out in the shop working. So he was hands-on. He learned a lot through hard experiences. He learned that crushing defeat and deep humiliation often follows hard on the heels of greatest victory. That's one of your things there. So he learned that crushing defeat and deep humiliation often follow on the heels of our greatest victories. You can't get complacent. you hear this from coaches all the time, it's easier to get to the top than it is to stay at the top. So once you get there, you got to stay there. So one example here is right after Christ commended him for his great confession, and back there in Matthew 16:16 we read a few minutes ago, he also then got the harshest rebuke. One moment Jesus called Peter blessed, promised him the keys of the kingdom. In the next paragraph, he addresses him as Satan. He says, "Get behind me," meaning don't stand in my way. So without realizing it here, Peter was trying to dissuade Christ from the very thing he came to earth to do, which was die on the cross. When he was telling him that he was going to have to die on the cross, Peter said, "No, that's not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen." Peter said, "The devil's speaking through you, trying to be a stumbling block to me." He said, "Get behind me. Get out of my way. I've got to do this." Okay. So here he calls him Satan. So as usual, he was speaking when he should have been listening. And here he learned that God would reveal truth to him, and he would guide his speech if he submitted his mind to the truth. He couldn't think physically. He couldn't think carnally. He had to think spiritually. His message he was going to preach was not human. It was not dependent on humans. It was coming from the Lord. So he had to go that part. And he found out that Satan could fill his mouth just as surely as the Lord could. He had to be careful where he was getting these things from. Example 2 was Peter fell victim to Satan again on the night of his arrest, Jesus' arrest. Again, he learned the hard way that how humanly weak he was, and he couldn't trust in his own resolve. You know, he swore. He said, "I'll be with you. I'll not leave you." And he said it in front of the whole group. "I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to do that." But then we still will go. He stiffed him as weak. So all these things that Peter learned by experience, sometimes they were bitter, sometimes they were humiliation, sometimes they were painful, other times they were encouraging, uplifting, but either way, he learned from them. Last thing, we'll hit it here pretty quick. Character qualities that define a true leader. We could talk about this one all night. But the third element making a leader is the right character. Character has been defined a lot of different ways. One of them is how you behave when you think nobody's watching. Okay? So that's your true character. You can have your personality, what people think you are. And I heard a quote, and I can't remember the whole quote, but it's something like a tree in the shadow that it lives. But the tree is who you are, and the shadow of that tree, the shade, that's what people see of you, who they think you are. So what really matters is who you are. And character is important. Now, in our country today, unfortunately, it's hard to find a leader who has much character. And we've had to pick between leaders who are the lesser of the two evils. That's my opinion. I challenge anybody to prove me wrong on that one. You know, I heard a thing, this guy, during our last election, when our two was running, and it was a foreigner, and he said, the country is big and as great as the United States. Well, however many million people y'all got, that's the two best y'all could have to pick from to be the leader of your country. You know, and that's kind of unfortunately where we are. But character is important, whether we want to believe it is or not anymore. It still is. Lasting leadership is grounded in character. Character produces respect. Respect produces trust, and trust motivates followers. We went back to that followership. If you're going to have people follow you, you got to do things that they lead. They got to believe in you. Even in the earthly realm, not even talking about spiritual stuff, people recognize a true leadership has integrity, trustworthiness, respectability, unselfishness, humility, self-discipline, self-control, courage. All those things are values that are image of God in us. And whether they want to deny that there is a God or not, and whether they want to deny that Christianity is how you should live, they still all recognize, well, those are good qualities. Who determined that was good? We know within ourselves those are things that are good, because God put that in us to recognize good qualities, good character. So obviously a man that's in spiritual leadership has to be even more of that. He has to be Christ-like. And that's why a leader has to manifest himself in a Christ-like manner. And through those qualities, Peter developed them through Christ by being associated with him for those times. We tell our kids all the time, you're going to be like the 5 people you spend the most time with. They don't like to hear that, but it's true. And that's true even for us as adults, I believe. Be careful who your friends are, because they're going to influence you. And that's important. Quick saying here, J.R. Miller had this quote. He said, "The only thing that walks back from the tomb with the mourners and refuses to be buried is the character of a man. What a man is survives him. It can never be buried." I think that was a great quote. The only thing that walks back from the tomb with the mourners and refuses to be buried is the character of a man. What a man is survives him. It can never be buried. What's most important is the impact that we have on other people. And that's, I kind of felt like being a teacher and being a coach was kind of a calling, and I felt like it was a ministry where I was able to have an impact on kids when they were able to be shaped. And those of us in here who are teachers, I believe we all agreed to that was one thing that motivated us to do the job, was the influence that we had on kids that we were around. Quick thing here, how did Peter's life end? We're not told in the Bible, other than we are told that Jesus told Peter he would die as a martyr. We see that in John 21, verses 18 and 19. So Scripture doesn't record his death, but historians tell us that he was crucified. And also that he was crucified upside down. That when they told him he was going to be crucified, he said, I'm not worthy to be crucified like my Lord was. Crucify me upside down. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but there are historians from that time who record that. It's not in the Scripture, so we don't have that to tell us that, but we do have that much of it. The last thing, and I did not know this until I was studying this, was that according to history, before he was crucified, he was made to watch his wife be crucified. And that would be even worse. As they led her away to be crucified, they crucified her first. He said he called out to her and said, remember the Lord. Okay? But dying is not the worst thing that can happen to us. For a Christian, from what Paul said, I'm ready to go. It'd be better for me to die right now because I'm ready. But it'd be benefit of y'all for me to stay, so I stayed. So he's encouraging his wife here, if that's true, is that remember the Lord. They can take your life, but they can't take your soul. There's something better waiting for us. Okay? So Peter, I think, was a great leader. He didn't start out that way. He had to be molded into that leader, but he did have certain characteristics within him that made him have that potential to be a great leader. And for us, I hope that maybe this lesson will make us see ways that we can be a good leader, whether that's if you're leading one other person, you're still a leader. If you're leading your family, if you're leading your children, you're a leader. Okay, so appreciate your time, your attention tonight. Come back next week, and we will talk about our next man. Thank you, and we'll close with a prayer. Father, thank you for today, for all the many blessings you blessed us with, for the opportunity to come back tonight, study and lesson of thy word. Pray, Father, that as we study these things, that we could see how you have dealt with people in the past, and knowing that you are constant and you never change, and the same things are expected of these early men are expected of us today. Pray, Father, that we would take courage from their example and their leadership. We would help to lead the church into the way it should go and make it grow this time into the future. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.